They shared a bed for 19 years, but the distance between them grew wider every night. She couldn't remember his last embrace, only the cold space where love used to be. Hashtag they slept in the same bed for 19 years, yet she couldn't remember the last time he held her. The bedroom was exactly 72 degrees, the way Thomas liked it. Margaret lay on her side of the bed, the invisible line between them as solid as any wall. She stared at the ceiling fan making its slow rotations, counting the shadows it cast across the pale blue paint. 4 blades, endless circles, going nowhere. 19 years of sharing this bed, this room, this life. She turned her head slightly to look at him. Thomas was already asleep, his back to her, his breathing steady and rhythmic. The alarm clock on his nightstand glowed 10:47 p.m. He always fell asleep within minutes of his head touching the pillow. She envied that about him, that ability to shut off the world so completely. When had it started? This distance, this careful choreography of 2 people occupying the same space while existing in separate universes. Margaret closed her eyes and tried to remember the last time he had held her. Really held her. Not the perfunctory hug at their daughter's wedding 3 months ago, posed for photographs. Not the brief touch of his hand on her shoulder when he passed behind her chair at dinner, but held her, arms wrapped around her, her head against his chest, his chin resting on her hair. The way he used to, the memory wouldn't come. It was like reaching for a word on the tip of your tongue that refuses to materialize. She knew it had happened once, many times surely. But when? 5 years ago? 10? Longer? They had met at a company picnic in the summer of 1985. Margaret had been 23, fresh out of college, working in the accounting department. Thomas was 26, ambitious, already making a name for himself in sales. He had approached her during the volleyball game, his smile confident, his polo shirt crisp despite the July heat. "You're new," he had said, not as a question but as a fact he was pleased to have discovered. 3 months, she had replied, shielding her eyes from the sun to look up at him. "Long enough to know whether you like it here." "I'm still deciding." "How about I help you decide over dinner?" She had laughed at his presumption, but she had also said yes. That dinner had led to another and another. Within 6 months they were engaged. Within a year married. Thomas was a planner, and Margaret had loved that about him then. While her friends were dating men who couldn't commit to weekend plans, Thomas talked about 5-year goals and retirement accounts. He had seemed solid, dependable, safe. The wedding night had been awkward, both of them nervous despite their modern pretenses. But afterward, lying in the hotel room bed with the city lights filtering through the curtains, Thomas had held her. His arm circled her waist, pulling her back against his chest. "Mrs. Collins," he'd whispered into her hair, "my wife." And she had felt in that moment absolutely certain she had made the right choice. Their first apartment had been tiny, a 1-bedroom in a complex that smelled like other people's cooking. But they had been happy, hadn't they? She remembered coming home from work to find him already there, tie loosened, stirring something on the stove. He would turn when she came in, and she would go to him, and he would kiss her hello. And at night they would curl together on the second-hand couch to watch television, or lie in bed talking about nothing and everything, his fingers tracing patterns on her arm. When had that stopped? Sarah had been born in their 3rd year of marriage. Margaret could still remember Thomas's face when the nurse placed their daughter in his arms, the way his eyes had filled with tears he didn't let fall. "She's perfect," he had said. "You're perfect." And that night, in the hospital room, he had held Margaret's hand and kissed her forehead and told her she was the strongest person he had ever known. The early years of parenthood had been exhausting. Sarah didn't sleep through the night until she was almost 2. Margaret had gone back to work after 12 weeks, and they had fumbled through a routine of daycare pickups and dinner preparations and laundry that never seemed to end. They were tired all the time. Margaret remembered snapping at Thomas over dishes left in the sink, Thomas snapping back about the grocery list he had asked for twice. But they had still been a team, hadn't they? Still united in their devotion to this tiny person who needed everything from them. She remembered one night when Sarah was about 3, sick with a fever that wouldn't break. They had taken turns sitting up with her, cold washcloths and children's Tylenol and whispered songs. At 4 in the morning, when the fever finally dropped, Thomas had come to find Margaret in the kitchen where she sat, head in her hands, exhausted and wrung out. He had pulled her to her feet and into his arms, and they had stood there, swaying slightly, not saying anything, just breathing together, united. When had that stopped? Thomas had gotten the promotion when Sarah was in kindergarten. It meant more money, which they needed. It also meant more hours, more travel, more stress. Margaret had understood. She had been supportive. She had handled the bedtime routines and the parent-teacher conferences and the birthday parties on her own. Thomas was building a future for them. Thomas was providing. But somewhere in those years the pattern had changed. Thomas came home later, left earlier. Dinners together became less frequent. By the time Sarah was in middle school, it was just the two of them most nights, Margaret and her daughter, talking about school and boys and friendship drama. While Thomas worked late or traveled for conferences, Margaret had told herself it was temporary. When this project was done, when that client was secured, when the next quarter ended, temporary. Except it never ended. It just became their life. She had tried to talk to him about it once, she remembered now. Sarah must have been about 13. Margaret had planned a special dinner for their anniversary, had arranged for Sarah to sleep at a friend's house, had actually bought a new dress. Thomas had called at 6 to say he was running late. At 7 to say he was still in the meeting. At 8:30 he had come through the door to find Margaret on the couch, dress wrinkled, candles burned down to nothing, food cold. "I'm sorry," he had said, and he had looked sorry, tired and sorry. This deal is just crucial right now, and they needed. "Do you know what today is?" she had asked quietly. "Of course I do. I'm sorry, Margaret. I'll make it up to you this weekend. We'll go to that restaurant you like." But they hadn't. That weekend Sarah had a soccer tournament, and the weekend after Thomas had a golf commitment with clients, and then the moment had passed, buried under the accumulation of other moments, other disappointments too small to name but that added up to something heavy. When Sarah left for college, Margaret had thought things might change. Just the two of them again, like the beginning. She had imagined leisurely dinners, spontaneous weekend trips, reconnection. But the opposite had happened. Without Sarah to talk about, to organize around, they had discovered they didn't have much to say to each other. The house felt too big, too quiet. Thomas worked even more, and Margaret filled her time with book clubs and volunteer work in elaborate gardens that Thomas barely noticed. They still functioned. They were polite. Thomas asked about her day, and she asked about his. They consulted each other about household decisions and tax returns and whether to refinish the deck. They attended social functions together, and their friends probably thought they were fine. More than fine. Stable. Successful. Still together after all these years, in an age when so many marriages failed. But in this bed, in the darkness, with 3 feet of empty space between them, Margaret knew the truth. They were roommates, polite strangers who shared a mortgage and a history but not a life. Not anymore. She tried to remember the last time they had made love. That memory was clearer, unfortunately. Their anniversary 2 years ago. Thomas had been home, for once, and they had gone through the motions of celebration, dinner, wine, the expected gestures. In bed that night he had reached for her, and she had responded because that's what you did, wasn't it? After 19 years of marriage. But it had been perfunctory, awkward, both of them focused on getting through it rather than experiencing it. Afterward he had rolled away immediately, mumbling something about an early meeting. She had lain there feeling more alone than if she had been by herself. And yet she stayed. They both stayed. Why? Fear, habit, the sunk cost of 2 decades? Margaret didn't know anymore. There was no violence, no betrayal, no obvious reason to leave. Just this slow erosion, this gradual diminishing of what they had once been to each other. She thought about the girl she had been at 23, accepting that dinner invitation. Would she have believed you if you had told her this was where it would lead? That the confident, attentive man across the table would become the distant stranger in this bed? That the passion and promise would drain away so gradually that you couldn't pinpoint when it happened, only look up one day and realize it was gone? But it wasn't all Thomas's fault, was it? Margaret forced herself to be honest. She had withdrawn too, built her own walls, found her own separate life. When had she last really tried to reach him? When had she last suggested they needed help, needed to talk, needed something to change? She had settled for this too, accepted it. Maybe even, in some ways, preferred it. No conflict, no mess, no risk. Just this quiet, careful distance. Thomas stirred in his sleep, turning slightly. For a moment Margaret held her breath, wondering if he might reach for her, if his sleeping body might remember what his waking mind had forgotten. But he settled again, facing her now but still separate, still distant. She looked at his face in the dim light from the window. He was 55 now, lines around his eyes that hadn't been there when they met. Gray threaded through his hair. He was handsome still, in a distinguished way that had probably helped his career. She wondered if he was happy, if he lay awake on his side of the bed, wondering the same things she wondered, or if he slept easily, satisfied with this life they had built, this comfortable, empty life. The fan continued its rotations overhead. Outside, a car passed on the street. The house settled with small creaks and sighs, all the familiar sounds of a life, a home, a marriage. Margaret rolled onto her back again, pulling the covers up to her chin. Tomorrow they would wake up and go through their routines. Coffee and newspaper and whatever the day required. They would be polite and functional and fine, just like always, but something in her chest ached. For the young couple in the tiny apartment, for the new parents swaying together in the kitchen, for the possibility of being held, of being known, of being more than this careful performance of marriage. She closed her eyes, but sleep wouldn't come. Beside her, Thomas breathed steadily, already dreaming of whatever he dreamed about these days. And Margaret counted fan blade rotations in the dark, 19 years of nights stretching behind her, wondering how many more stretched ahead, and whether it was too late to bridge the distance that had grown between them while she wasn't paying attention. 72 degrees, the perfect temperature, not too hot, not too cold, just exactly, precisely comfortable.